We're wrapping up today with an energetic, big picture look at the economy. Dr. Anirban Basu, Chairman and CEO of the SAGE Policy Group, is here to mix insight with a dash of humor as he breaks down what's really happening in the markets and what it means for construction in the year ahead. Let's welcome Dr. Basu.
Hello, my name is Anirban Basu. I'm an economist. Please hold any further applause. And Kahua has been gracious enough to invite me to talk about the economy. My presentation today is entitled Monetary Masala. It's a play on a 1991 film starring the two actors you see on the screen. In fact, you see them in larger size right here. One with whom undoubtedly you're very familiar, the actor Denzel Washington, recently named by the New York Times as the greatest actor of the 21st century. The other actor you might be a bit less familiar with. Her name is Srita Chowdhury, the Indian-British actress. 1991's Mystic Masala was her cinematic debut. I've been following her career ever since. In fact, I met her at JFK Airport. We're on the same flight from New York to New Delhi. Before the flight, I actually approached her, started talking to her, undaunted by her fame. And my very strong belief is, had another 15 seconds, I could have changed both of our lives. But if I'm being honest, the encounter did not work exactly as I had envisioned or hoped. And so I'm going to stick with Denzel Washington as the unifying theme of this presentation. And I will talk about tariffs. I'll talk about immigration policy too. I'll talk about all manner of policies emanating from Washington, D.C. But I want to do much more than that. I want to talk about the 2026 economic outlook, inflation, interest rates, etc. So now I will say about that policymaking that if we were in low interest, low inflation times, those policies would have one set of implications. But as you know, we've been living through higher interest rates and higher inflation, and so those policies have perhaps a different set of implications. This title slide is a play on a 2009 Denzel Washington film called The Taking of Pelham 123, in which he stars as a train dispatcher. But the taking of inflation 2.0, of course, refers to the fact that the Federal Reserve's target for inflation is 2%, and we have not been at that target rate of inflation in this country for more than 4 years, approaching 5 years now. So that burst of inflation shows up in early 2021, or almost early 2026. And the most recent data indicate we remain mired in inflationary times. Two measures of inflation here. The green line is inflation as measured by the core consumer price index. Core means all items minus food and energy. Food and energy prices are important. We'll talk about those momentarily. But we economists often fixate on core metrics because food and energy prices are A, volatile, and B, more importantly, susceptible to non-economic influences like natural disasters, weather, and geopolitics. And so to derive a pure measure of economic inflation, we often look at these core metrics, and that measure says inflation over the last 12 months running at 3.0%. And actually, if you look at that green line, it's sort of hidden a bit by the blue line. But if you look at it, you can see that you might notice that for much of this year, inflation has been re-accelerating. If you look at the blue line, that's inflation as measured by the Federal Reserve's favorite measure of inflation, the core PCE deflator, the personal consumption expenditure deflator. That's this inflation running at 2.9% year over year. And you can see again that upward tilted inflation if you look at the end of that time series. Now, some of that's obvious why that's happening, that re-acceleration of inflation. But this has many implications for the economy, including for interest rates, which impacts obviously every contractor, whether it's because of equipment financing costs or the project financing costs faced by our customers and clients. And of course, it has implications for the 2/3 of the US economy that's comprised by the American consumer. This is the consumer price index, broken down. But I'm starting with May of 2020 here as the baseline. Why May of 2020? That's the first month of the current economic expansion. You might remember in April of 2020, governors like Ron DeSantis of Florida and Brian Kemp of Georgia began reopening their economy. So we lost a ton of jobs in March and April of 2020. We started to add back jobs in May of 2020, in part because some governors had reopened their states. Not saying that that was good policymaking or bad policymaking, that's for you to decide. But it did position those like Florida and Georgia, those states to start adding back jobs around that time. And by May of 2020, the recession's over. The overall nation is starting to regain or recover jobs. Now, the headline inflation numbers, because I'm taking this look at May of 2020 prices and comparing those to September 2025. So it's roughly a 5-year comparison period, 5 1/3 years. So the headline inflation numbers for that 5+ year period are summarized in the blue color bars down below. So how much inflation did America experience in a bit more than 5 years in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum, 27%. Strip out food and energy prices still up to 24.5%. Now you can see energy prices up well over 50%, transportation services price up 53.3%. That affects contractors, of course, because contractors have to have, for instance, inputs to construction shipped to job sites, that kind of thing. And of course, Often, if you're in modular construction or doing things like prefabrication, often obviously those inputs have to be shipped to the offices. So I mean, so in any case, lots of shipping in construction, and obviously the industry has been affected by a rise in those costs. Shelter costs, that's apartment rents, for instance, up 29%, food prices up 28%. And that's what has many Americans most exercised, parenthetically, is that grocery bill. Oh, they complain about all manner of prices that they encounter, electricity rates, for instance, auto insurance rates. It's really that grocery bill that's captured their attention. One of the things I do a lot of as an economist is I talk to a lot of Americans about the economy. And these conversations often transpire in Ubers and Lyfts. Take a lot of Ubers and Lyfts, often to presentations. So I go to the airport, land at a certain place, then go to the hotel, speak, go back to the airport, that kind of thing. And many of you take Ubers and Lyfts. And therefore, as a passenger, you're rating the driver. You may be less aware the driver is rating you as a passenger. And I very recently become privy to my passenger ratings, and they're extremely low. And you might say, well, Anirban, that makes sense. We've been listening to you speak now for about 5 minutes. I think this is beyond my personality, because I take every Uber or Lyft trip as an opportunity to interview an American. And I'll ask the question and of course I'm doing this from the back seat, I'll ask the question hey, how much do you really make doing this on an hourly basis once you factor depreciation, insurance, and gasoline? What's your highest level of education attainment? What are the options that you have? Have you ever considered an apprenticeship program? What does your family say about all this? Do you actually view this as a career? Why would you choose this vehicle in particular? And apparently these questions are off-putting. But when you ask people about the economy, the number one thing they talk about is right here, inflation. They can't keep up. And of course, earlier this year, we had a president inaugurated. So number 45 is come number 47, the re-election of Donald John Trump. I call this slide the Manhattan candidate, because of course there's some affinity between Manhattan and Donald Trump, but also Queens and Mar-a-Lago. But this is also played on a 2004 Denzel Washington film called The Manchurian Candidate, in which he stars as Major Bennett Marco, itself a remake of a 1962 film starring Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury. Now, tariffs, of course. Whether a nation's 50%, EU 15%, those are taxes on U.S. importers. Some of that cost gets passed along to customers, consumers. Of course, key inputs to production have also been subject to significant tariffs. 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, 25% tariff on vehicles would tend to be inflationary. Now, on July 4th of this year, the president signed the One Big Beautiful Bill. Lots of excitement in corporate America about the passage of that bill, including because of the restoration of 100% bonus depreciation, which may support many contractors presently listening to this webinar. But the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office indicates that will add $3.4 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years, $4.1 trillion if you add in interest on top of an existing national debt of $38 trillion plus. And to the extent that that tax cut pushes more money back into the economy, that would tend to be inflationary. And then, of course, mass deportations. Now, look, I understand the southern border is a major issue. I get that. Because one of the things I do a lot of is I watch a ton of Fox News. I watch a ton of Fox News. I watch Fox News because my mom makes me. So I live 4.5 miles away from my parents in Baltimore County, Maryland. I'm with them a lot. My mom tends to hang out near the kitchen, and she watches Fox News all day, every day, without exception. My father is on the other side of the house in his home office, likes to write, play online bridge, and he watches CNN all day, every day, without exception. And my goal when I go to their home is to keep them apart. Because when they get together, that's when all heck breaks loose and I have to leave the house. But the point is, I watch a ton of Fox News. I get it. The southern border has been an issue. That said, to the extent that this truncates the labor force, to the extent that this means fewer workers in restaurants, hotels, agriculture, food processing, food distribution, childcare, landscaping, construction, etc., that would tend to be inflationary. And the Federal Reserve is looking at all this and asks the question, well, what do we do about interest rates? Because we're still not back to 2% inflation, and we have more inflationary pressures in front of us, perhaps, tariffs, etc. This is the principal mechanism by which the Federal Reserve influences economic growth and its byproduct inflation, the federal funds rate, also known as the Fed funds rate, also known as the overnight bank lending rate. When this rate is set at a low level, banks are more likely to borrow from one another, showing up their reserves in the process, and they're lending more aggressively in the economy. When this rate is set at a higher level, an opposing behavior ensues. Now, again, that surge in inflation shows up in early 2021. But the Federal Reserve in 2021 doesn't do anything about that. So what's being graphed for you here is the upper limit on the federal funds rate. So the minimum possible here is 0.25%. That's exactly where rates are taken as the pandemic undoes the economy, but then inflation. No action in 2021 to combat that inflation, to slow down the economy. But in March of 2022, March 16th to be precise, the Federal Reserve begins to increase interest rates. And between that day in March of 2022 and July 26th of 2023, they take the upper limit on the federal funds rate from 0.25% to 5.5% at the cyclical apex. Now, late last year, they start cutting rates. So it starts on September 18th of last year, half a percentage point rate cut. Then in November 7th, 2 days after election, another quarter point rate cut. December 18th, a quarter point rate cut. So by the end of last year, the federal funds rate on the upper limit is down to 4.5%. And then we get rate cuts this year, September, and then October, now down to 4%. You can see that on the slide. Big debate about whether or not they'll cut rates in December, about a 50-50 chance, according to the bond market. But even if they do, the point of the slide is still made. Interest rates will still enter 2026 at an elevated level, again, affecting project financing costs and the overall economy. Now, I will say that if you look at the overall economy, it's continued to perform despite these higher rates of interest. So if you look at, for instance, growth in gross domestic product, our broad indication of U.S. economic progress, last reading here is from the second quarter of 2025, according to which U.S. economy expands 3.8% on an annualized basis. We don't yet have third quarter data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but we do have an estimate from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, their GDP Now model, which indicates that during the third quarter of the year, the U.S. economy expanded 4.2% on an annualized basis. Don't believe it? My very strong sense is that model has yet to take into account the impact of the federal government shutdown. That shutdown will take about 1.5% off of third quarter GDP. So that number is probably going to be in the range of 2.5%, 2%, something like that. Nonetheless, that's not recession. That's momentum. At the heart of that momentum has been the fighting force known as the American consumer. Here are monthly retail sales. Last reading here is for August of 2025, a perfectly fine month for retail sales. Of course, you hear stories. Weakness at Chipotle. Rite Aid is no longer in business. Starbucks is closing stores. Starbucks actually went so far because of some weak quarters to fire their CEO. The previous CEO is a guy named Lakshman Narasimhan. Looks just like me. It's incredible. Many people think I've lost my job, but I haven't. Now, the new CEO is a guy named Brian Niccol who comes over from Chipotle, and one of the things he's been doing is closing those stores. So you hear stories like that, but overall, if you look at the macroeconomic data, the consumer has been spending. And by the way, much of the growth of consumer outlays has not been on retail items here depicted, but rather on services, things like travel. So at least before the federal government shutdown, if you looked at TSA checkpoint counts, there are more people passing through those checkpoints this year than last year, again, before the shutdown, an indication that people have been traveling. And 2024 was a perfectly fine year for U.S. travel, parenthetically. They're spending on Beyonce concert tickets. They're spending on Taylor Swift concert tickets. In August of 2023, the average Taylor Swift concert ticket purchased on resale, and that's how Americans buy them on resale, sold for $1,619 per ticket. She sold at football stadiums in this country multiple times, often same city, same week. She's just for Australia, parenthetically. The Australian government thanked her for improving their economy. She generated about $300 million of economic impact in 5 days. She's not merely a musical phenomenon. She's an economic one. And I would say, too, as a humble aside, that this thing between her and Travis Kelce remains the greatest thing happening in America. This is phenomenal. It's fabulous. It's fantastic. It's not at all annoying. And what you have here is this hunky athlete of Kansas City Chiefs, 3-time Super Bowl winning tight end Travis Kelce, in a relationship with the savvy singer-songwriter Taylor Swift. There are pictures of them kissing on the internet. And this has many Americans aglow, abuzz, and hopeful. And there is reason for hope. Because unlike many stories, this one stands down well. Because when that breakup occurs, and it will occur, the music is going to flow, and I, for one, cannot wait. Now, I'm going to make the case later on during the presentation that the consumer cannot continue to spend as they have been, but not yet. Because here's something else that happened in America during a period of high interest rates that one may not have anticipated. America got much wealthier. This is still U.S. household wealth. Back in 1990, which is not that long ago, total U.S. household wealth is sitting at $20 trillion. And we thought we were pretty wealthy back then. By the end of last year and beginning of this year, it's over $160 trillion. And because of recent surge in stock prices, up to $167 trillion. America has never been wealthier. And there's a wealth effect. When people feel wealthier, are wealthier, they spend more money in the economy, which keeps the economy going, the business cycle going. So you might point out to me, Anirban, that wealth is not neatly distributed across the population. And that point is made by other Federal Reserve Bank data summarized here. Here we're simply stacking the most affluent households in America down through the least affluent and ask the question, where does the wealth reside in America? So if you look at that light green slice at the very top of the slide, that's the wealth controlled by the top 0.1% of Americans. That's your 1 in 1,000 household or better. There are about 340,000 members of those households. And that group controls 13.9% of American wealth. The next segment in green, darker green, is the wealth controlled by the balance of the top 1%, such as 99th percentile to 99.9th percentile. They control 17.1% of the nation's wealth. So the top 1% controls 31% of the nation's wealth. The yellow segment below that is the wealth controlled by the 90th percentile to 99th percentile, the balance of the top 10%. They control 36.4% of the nation's wealth. So the top 10% controls a bit more than 2/3 of the nation's wealth. The brown segment below that is the wealth controlled by the 50th percentile to the 90th percentile. That's 40% of America's population. And that 40% controls 30.1% of the nation's wealth, which means at the bottom, 50% of Americans control 2.5% of the nation's wealth. Top 50%, 97.5%, bottom 50%, 2.5%. It's two different countries. From a wealth profile perspective, America is two separate nations. You can call it haves and have-nots, haves and have-less, haves and have-yachts. Whatever you want to call it, it is two different countries, at least two, from a wealth profile perspective. Now, many of the people in the bottom 50% are homeowners. The U.S. home ownership rate during the second quarter of this year was 65.1%. So many of them have equity in their homes, but they have very little financial wealth. They live from paycheck to paycheck or on fixed incomes. And what do you need in a country with so much wealth disparity, so much wealth inequality? What's obvious is readily apparent. I don't have to tell you, you need an equalizer. Now, this is Denzel playing the part of Robert McCall. This was such a good movie. They made it 3 times with almost no change in plot. The last time being 2023. They're all excellent films. And economically, what has been the equalizer? It's been that fabulous job market. Unfortunately, this is where you see the softness in the U.S. economy. Look, for instance, at data from the JOLTS, the Job Opens and Labor Turnover Survey. In August, America home to 7.2 million available unfilled jobs. Not catastrophic, akin to where we had been pre-pandemic. But it is now the case that we have more unemployed Americans. In August, we had 7.4 million unemployed Americans than job openings, 7.2 million. And one of the segments in which we've observed a radical decline in job openings, as it turns out, is construction. It's the U.S. construction job openings. That figure plummeted in August to nearly a 10-year low, and that surprised me. Why did it surprise me? Because I had thought that with many contractors having to replace undocumented workers with documented ones, that this would actually lead to a stabilization of job openings in construction, right? Because more advertisements for positions to be filled. But that's not what we saw. Now, why is this happening? Probably because construction spending has fallen, but I'll talk about that later on during the presentation. Now, another place where you see the evidence of economic slowing is in that monthly jobs number. So this is that headline number that comes up the first Friday of every month. Typically, of course, that did not happen during the federal government shutdown. But we just did on recent Thursday get the September 2025 jobs report, and that month America added 119,000 jobs. A good reading, a fine reading. But if you look at the last 5 months, and remember all these data are subject to massive revisions. If you look at the last 5 months, on average, America's averaged 39,000 jobs added. In fact, a couple of months, you might notice, have been negative in terms of job creation. In 2024, on average, we create 186,000 jobs a month. So this thing is really solid. You can see that what's happened over the course of time. Unemployment has risen over the course of the year from 4% at the beginning of the year to 4.4% now. And so, a real softening there. Now, let me give you some regional data. But now I'm going to give you also some historical data, because I'm going back to February of 2020 as the baseline. Why February of 2020? That's the last month before we shut down the U.S. economy. So if you look at jobs back then in February of 2020 for these 25 very large American communities and compare those job tallies to August of 2025, you get these percentage deltas. The left-hand column includes those regions that have added jobs fast. There's a neat correspondence between population growth and job growth. Those things also move in tandem. Austin, Texas recently supplanted Portland, Oregon to become the 25th most populous metropolitan area in the country. And Austin could have its own column. No boomtown in America like Austin, Texas. Hasn't been. Now, in percentage job growth terms, Nashville comes close, Boise, Idaho comes close, but Austin almost by itself. And by the way, much of the growth in Austin has been technology-led, because much of Silicon Valley has established meaningful beachheads in the Austin metropolitan area, including Apple, of course, with its massive campus. Dallas, number 2. In recent years, no region of the country added more people in absolute terms than the Dallas metropolitan area. That's North Texas. It has been booming. semiconductor plants under construction. Flat land, favorable rainfall, very developable, a favorable state tax policy, no state income tax, favorable zoning policy, lots of infrastructure leverage. Dallas is just poised for growth. By the way, no region of the country overpays their quarterback as much as the Dallas metropolitan area, but I'm persuaded that those things are purely coincidental. In any case, Austin, Dallas, Orlando, San Antonio, Charlotte, Tampa, Phoenix, Atlanta, Houston, Miami. What's that? That's the American South. That's where the population growth has been. That's where the job growth has been. The right-hand column includes those slower growing markets, less population growth, less job growth. Much of that is the Northeast, New York, my town of Baltimore, Washington Metro, and Boston, number 23. Now, Boston is a very successful community with companies operating at the cutting edge of defense technologies, financial services, IT, and life sciences. Moderna is headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as an example. But because it's so successful, higher education, obviously a major component, it's very expensive. And many Americans have been searching for affordability during these inflationary times. It's predictable. And so they've been moving out of Boston, those centrifugal forces, into surrounding areas in Maine, New Hampshire, Providence, Rhode Island, that kind of thing. And we'll see that across the country. And parenthetically, or not actually coincidentally, you can see two markets at the very bottom there, 24 and 25, very expensive California markets, Los Angeles, San Francisco. So you see a massive in-migration from San Francisco to Sacramento and Reno, from Los Angeles to Bakersfield and Fresno and Phoenix, and so on and so forth. And now you also see the monsters of the Midwest in that right-hand column. Chicago, number 15. Detroit, 19. Minneapolis, 20. St. Louis, 22. Slower population growth, slower job growth. Now the next slide, same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of employment growth, this is construction employment growth. And now you observe something different. Number 1 is Minneapolis. Number 3 is Detroit. Number 5 is St. Louis. Number 7 is Chicagoland. How is this possible? A couple of ways to create construction jobs. One, of course, through population growth, because that creates demand for housing and attendant commercial construction, dry cleaners, restaurants, retailers. But another way is through mega projects. And the Midwest has been really quite good at attracting data centers and manufacturing facilities. And you need, for any of these projects, you need power and water. Midwest has that. More affordable than many markets. Often infrastructure built for a larger population that exists presently. So again, attract a lot of mega projects, and you see that. Now you see some correlation between the last two slides. And number 24 is Los Angeles, number 25 is San Francisco. Now the next slide, same 25 major metropolitan areas, but now these are rates of unemployment. And now if you look to the bottom, if you look toward the bottom of the right-hand column, you can see again that new story emerging in America, that economic weakness. Houston, 5% unemployment. San Diego, 5%. Philly, 5.1%. New York, 5.2%. LA, 5.9% unemployment in August. Riverside, 6.1%. Riverside is now the 12th largest metropolitan area in the country. Now, I don't mean to make a mountain out of a molehill. Those rates are astronomical, but they're higher than they were. In Boston, I delivered a presentation a few weeks ago in Foxborough, Massachusetts, home to the New England Patriots. Very good year this year. A year ago, their unemployment rate was 4%. Now it's 4.5%. Again, that's not astronomical, but higher than it was. And that suggests, again, that virtuous cycle is starting to break apart. And what does that virtuous cycle consist? Consumer spending, impact employers hiring, which fuels further spending. But now we have more consumers facing financial difficulty, and we have fewer employers who are willing to hire. In fact, we've seen a pickup in layoff activity recently. So let me use that as a segue to talk about some risks to the macroeconomic outlook. And I use this slide as the segue, Devil in a Bunch of Data, which is a play in 1995, Denzel Washington film called Devil in a Blue Dress, in which he stars as a very handsome Easy Rawlins. The film is rooted in Los Angeles and embraces the film noir vibe. And I think one of the elements of being the greatest actor of the 21st century is being attractive. And Denzel Washington is that. He's a very handsome gentleman. He's very good looking. Dare I say gorgeous. And, I'm married with 2 children, but I can still tell. You know what I mean? In any case, if you're going to talk about risks of the macroeconomic outlook, you've got to start with the consumer. You cannot have an economic downturn unless the consumer participates. Only the consumer is the instigator of an economic downturn. For that, you need the commercial real estate debacle in the 1980s and attendant savings and loans crisis. Or you need the dot-com bubble bursting in 2000, followed by the 2001 recession. Or you need the housing bubble bursting in 05, 06, 07, followed by the 07, 09 recession. Or you need COVID. But at some point, the consumers got to become involved in that dynamic for there to be an economy-wide, full-fledged economic downturn. And thus far, Chipotle, Target, Starbucks, May retail sales notwithstanding, the consumer has not been engaged in that dynamic. But can they continue to spend as they have been? And that was it to an analysis from from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and the metric we interest here is personal or household savings measured in billions of dollars. So if you look at that green line at the bottom of the slide, that's personal savings measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. And you can observe a reasonably smooth trajectory of personal savings as we march toward the pandemic, but then the pandemic changes everything. Because during the pandemic, many Americans received stimulus payments, many American enterprises received paycheck protection support and other forms of support, including some businesses that may not have needed all that support, including the Los Angeles Lakers. And then, of course, many workers experienced meaningful increases in compensation. So for many American families, household income is rising precisely as their expenditure is dwindling because they're not taking vacations. They're not seeing movies or plays. They're not seeing Beyonce or Taylor Swift in concert or even Ice Spice or SZA. And so according to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, at the pinnacle, the American household that I'm asked about, you can see here $2.1 trillion in excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what they were saved for the pandemic. According to those same economists, by the end of last year, all those savings and then some had been spent down. A $2.4 trillion drawdown in savings. Now, as those savings hit the economy in the form of expenditures, it juiced the economy. Look at the back half of 2023. Third quarter GDP on an annualized basis of 4.7%. Fourth quarter of that year, 3.4%, and then 2.8% growth for all last year. Pretty impressive. But now what are you left with increasingly? A consumer who has spent down their pandemic savings and who can face high and rising prices. Now, having spent all that money, many of these consumers improve their standard of living. They now live in nicer apartments. They've dined at finer restaurants. They've taken nicer vacations. They wear nicer clothes from Lululemon or Viore. But now the money is gone and the prices keep rising. So how do they maintain that sort of living? Well, of course, you just turn to the credit card. U.S. credit card debt spiking. You may have heard about recent increases in 30-day and 90-day credit card delinquency. You may have heard that mortgage loan delinquency is up. Student loan delinquency is up, of course, because student loan repayment terms have changed this year. All loan delinquency is up. And you may have heard some prominent bankruptcies recently. Tricolor, the subprime auto lender, bankrupt. First Brands, the auto parts manufacturer, bankrupt. Raising some questions about private credit. Private credit is unregulated. It really has grown up since the end of the global financial crisis. So after the global financial crisis, we really restricted bank lending. So because the regulated banks could not lend as aggressively, private credit emerged and has continued to emerge in recent years. And we don't know what we don't know. Now, the pandemic has left behind some other lingering legacies. So I know there's been a lot of chatter this year about return to work. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan, the most powerful CEO, the most powerful person on Wall Street, saying, hey, you want a job at JP Morgan, you got to be in the office 5 days a week. Indeed, 54% of those who work for Fortune 100 companies are in the office 5 days a week now. And we know the federal government has gone back to the office too, to the extent that they've not been laid off. But it is still the case that remote work is very popular in this country. Office vacancy rates are high in much of the country, not everywhere. I just spoke in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 5% office vacancy rate in their downtown. But in certain older central business districts and the older buildings they're in, the Class B and Class C, that's where you see the issues. So these data come from CB Richard Ellis, CBRE. San Francisco is a massive office market. That's a citywide vacancy rate of 35%. Seattle, you see that skyline. It is glorious, 27% vacant. Chicago, glorious skyline, 27% vacant. Now, of course, we care about the building owners. Many of them are our customers and clients. But we also care about the bank's potential exposure to these dynamics. Now, I don't, again, mean to make a mountain of a molehill. I've yet to see one bank falter because of their exposure to commercial real estate, but it's a risk. Let me give you an example of what's been happening in America. About 10 months ago now, the Wall Street Journal penned an article featuring downtown St. Louis. Now, St. Louis, of course, is a beautiful, historic American city, and the tallest building in downtown St. Louis is the 44-story AT&T building. In 2006, that building sold for $205 million. It just sold for $3.5 million. Somebody takes that loss. And that kind of thing can put banks at risk because sometimes those buildings are their collateral. And also this impacts city finances in particular. So one of the underappreciated sources of economic growth in recent years has been growth in spending by state and local governments. In part, that's been happening because on March 11th of 2021, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which among other things gifted $350 billion in direct federal support to state and local governments. That money is gone. And with many commercial properties now suffering lower assessments for tax purposes, no surprise that many cities now find themselves in some challenging fiscal circumstances. So I'll go through these bullets in turn. With the city facing a projected $1.12 billion shortfall in 2026, Chicago Mayor Brad Johnson said recently, quote, "We have reached a point of no return." That is not upbeat, and Chicago is not alone. Between December of 2024 and April of 2025, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, and Washington all experienced credit rating downgrades, and they're not alone. According to research conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust, at least 20 of the nation's 25 most populous cities have reported budget gaps for fiscal year 2026 and often beyond. Now, one of the implications relates to infrastructure spending. So on November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that $1.2 trillion package. That authorization will last until September 30th of next year. And it's not clear what the Trump administration is going to do with reauthorization. We just don't know. But what we have heard is many Trump officials believe that cities and states should take on more responsibility for infrastructure financing. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. Again, that's for you to decide. But with many state and local governments not in great financial condition, my own state of Maryland was debt downgraded this year for the first time in 52 years. So we're no longer a universal AAA bond rated state, which is very upsetting to me personally. But setting that aside, the point is many states don't have that kind of borrowing capacity anymore. And the federal government's not going to fork over significant amounts of infrastructure financing. That suggests that in out years of this decade, infrastructure spending will be slower than it has been in recent years. And that, of course, overall weakens economic growth, but it also means something for maybe some of the contractors on this webinar. Now, let me talk about, therefore, the construction and real estate data more directly. And here I might be presenting some of the data in which you might have greatest interest. So I use this movie as a segue, 2016's Fences. This was a critically acclaimed film, absolute smash with the critics. This is Denzel starring as a Pittsburgh-based sanitation worker, which means, of course, that Denzel can look good doing anything, even if it involves being in the city of Pittsburgh. So in any case, I've been focused a lot on prices during this presentation. Let me focus on some more prices, but the most important prices in the economy are interest rates. So let me give you two more of those: 50-year fixed mortgage rate in green, 30-year fixed mortgage rate in blue. These data come from Freddie Mac. They come out each and every week. And for the last week for Treasury data, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate sitting at 6.26%. And you say, Anibon, you, sir, have a tendency to sensationalize, but even you cannot make a big deal of a 6.26% 30-year fixed mortgage rate, because I can remember mortgage rates were 21%, 18%, 15%, 13%. Fair enough. But to millennials and Generation Z, the youngest members of our workforce, these rates are preposterously high. And that's who's really dropped out of the single-family home purchasing marketplace. It's been that would-be first-time buyer, frustrated lack of inventory, high prices, and by their standards, extremely high borrowing costs. Now, as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, I want to share with you some leading economic indicators, because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been occurring to a discussion of what's likely to occur going forward. Here's the leading indicator. It's the U.S. mortgage loan applications composite index. Why are mortgage applications a leading indicator? Because often the journey to settlement table begins with a mortgage application. This is the first indication that someone now seeks to transact. But mortgage applications are down about 70% from their 2021 peak. So what does that tell us? Relatively few Americans are prepared to transact. They haven't even applied for their mortgage. It's Anibon. If the housing of the home buying population has been sort of directly curtailed or truncated, housing market must be in horrific shape, but it's not by many measures. Take U.S. home sales prices measured by the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index. Home sales price in America have effectively never been higher. You said increase in home sales price during the pandemic and early stage of recovery therefrom. That's a 35% increase in U.S. home sales price over a very short period of time. But of course, during the pandemic, our behavior changed. We're spending more time at home. We wanted more house. We wanted more square footage. We wanted room for home offices and home gyms. We wanted one just for the Peloton. Anytime you see a Peloton advertisement, the only piece of furniture in that room is the Peloton. That's how we Americans, the greatest people on this planet, choose to live. You buy a Peloton, you put it in a room, lock the door. And when people visit, you open the door, you splash some water on it. Many of us have done it. But the point is, at that point, pandemic ended and mortgage rates took off. So, what was I thinking naively? That we'd give back a meaningful chunk of those home sales price gains. You can see it happen for a few months, but not very deep and not very long. What did I fail to appreciate as an economist? What did I get wrong? I understood there are fewer buyers in the market. What I failed to appreciate is how few sellers there would be. Because if you're sitting in Duluth, Minnesota, or Kankakee, Illinois with a 2.75% 30-year fix, where are you going? You're not going anywhere. The tail wags the dog. You might want to sell that house. You liked it when you bought it. It fit your lifestyle. You're bored of it. Kids have left. You met your neighbors. Now you don't like it. And you want to move. But you can't move because the next mortgage rate is a 6% plus 30 fixed mortgage rate. So you stay where you are. Indeed, that helps explain this. This is the percentage of U.S. population that moved over the past year. It's plummeted, just staying in place. Now, this has really affected the southern markets because the southern markets are built around in-migration, the expectation that more people are going to move in. So if you break down the Case-Shiller Home Price Index by metropolitan area, and this is just for the 1 month, the last month for data, which is August of 2025. We're waiting for all these data to come in, but the 1 month percentage in August of 2025, you might notice that certain southern markets suffered a loss in home sales price. Phoenix, Tampa, Charlotte, Atlanta, Miami, Las Vegas, Dallas. Why? Because fewer people are moving and fewer people are moving in. And those housing markets are oriented around in-migration, and it's just not happening right now. So now this also affects construction dynamics. So here's another leading set of indicators, a set of leading economic indicators, U.S. residential building permits. So the orange line there is single family. Why are these leading economic indicators, parenthetically, or by the way? Because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build. The orange line is single family, green line is multifamily. Both of those have been trending lower. So we built, for instance, a ton of apartments over the last 3 years. But now many contractors tell me the multifamily activity has really slowed down. Now, why is that? Project financing costs are still high, interest rates are still high, and of course, materials prices have been rising. And then in many markets that have been red hot, apartment rents actually have been falling recently. So in markets like Denver, Tampa, Austin, Nashville, apartment rents have actually been falling during recent months in many instances. Why is that? The markets are saturated with new construction. If we went to downtown Nashville today, we'd say, wow, they've done an amazing job with this downtown. It's glorious, it's gorgeous. But also, if we try to rent an apartment, we might find that we might get 2 or 3 months free rent. You didn't see that a few months ago. So those pro formas no longer penciling out at a time of flat to falling apartment rents. Again, project financing costs are high because material costs are high and interest rates are still stubbornly elevated. Now, this next leading indicator is even broader, more inclusive. This is the Architecture Billings Index, and it's more inclusive because architects work on both residential and non-residential projects. See the 50-yard line? Running west across that slide, any reading less than 50 signifies that architects are less busy this month than they were last month. The last reading was 47.6, meaning that in October of 2025, architects were less busy than they were in September. In September, less busy than August, July, June, etc. Why is the leading economic indicator? Again, architects less busy upstream, contractors less busy downstream. And so what we've seen in non-residential construction and residential construction is a real slowdown in construction spending. So this is non-residential construction spending by subsector. August of 2024 to August of 2025, again, the last year for which we have data, total non-residential construction spending is down 1.5%. But notice, the tariffs were supposed to bring manufacturing activity back to America. Manufacturing-related construction, after rising for many years quite rapidly, is actually down 8.2% over the last 12 months. Lots of uncertainty in the economy. And about 50% of our imports are intermediate goods, meaning inputs to production. So manufacturing costs have gone higher. Their profit margins are impacted by that. They've tried not to pass along their cost increases to customers. And so this result ensues. Now, at the bottom, some of the categories that are expanding in terms of spending, at least over the past year, are those publicly financed segments. Public safety, that's your police stations and fire stations. It's up, but again, that infrastructure money coming out of the Biden administration is still being spent. Water supply, 3.3%. Transportation, that includes mass transit. Sewage and waste disposal is 95% publicly financed. Conservation development is your flood control. But where will we be in 2 years when that authorization is over? And we just, again, don't know what reauthorization looks like from the Trump administration. Okay. Again, one of the reasons that construction spending has fallen and that we've had fewer construction starts is right here. This is the Construction Materials Producer Price Index. It's construction materials inflation. Comparing February of 2020 materials prices to August of 2025, it's a comparison period I've used a number of times during this presentation. Overall inputs to construction industry is up 43% in roughly 5 years, 5.5 years as it turns out. So a lot of pro forma is not going to pencil out when you've got that kind of input inflation. And where do we see the highest increase in construction materials prices? It's in those items that are most affected by tariffs. Steel mill products, non-ferrous wire and cable, that's your copper wire and cable, fabricated structural metal projects, iron and steel. So again, we need these interest rates to come down to make more of these projects viable. But one of the reasons that interest rates will come down more quickly is because inflation is still stubbornly high. So closing out almost in this presentation, I want to give you just one last slide in this part of the presentation. Here I'm juxtaposing two data series for you. So the green line represents the amount that prices of construction inputs have increased since February of 2020. This is based on producer price index data. So start with February of 2020. How much have prices risen since February of 2020 for construction inputs? The blue line is non-residential bid prices. How much have they risen since February of 2020? Okay, now look at these two inflation series. Percentage change since February of 2020. You see how the green line gets a head start in 2020, 2021, and 2022? In other words, construction input prices are rising faster than non-residential bid prices. And that's when many contractors call their attorneys and ask the question, do we have a force majeure clause in this contract? Because fixed price contracts, they did not realize that steel and softwood lumber and these other prices will rise so rapidly, and now they're taking a hit on the project. They want to renegotiate or maybe even get out from under the deal. But what would economic theory predict? Economic theory would predict that eventually these lines converge. Why is that? Because construction is an incredibly competitive industry, something akin to perfect competition in economic theory. And in economic theory, in perfect competition, economic profits equal what? Zero. Not accounting profits, those are different. Economic profits. Profits emerging from the exercise of market power. And lo and behold, what do you see? By 2024, these lines have converged. But what do you observe more recently? Bid prices have flattened out in terms of the growth trajectory. Input prices are taking off, in part because of tariffs. And so this suggests that more contractors are facing downward pressure on their margins. And the tariffs are still in place, and the interest rates are still elevated. And that means that there could be further margin pressure during the year ahead. And so that takes me to the final part of the presentation, the forecast. The glory, as it turns out, is yours because, well, this presentation is almost over. Let me just show you some outlook estimates from various other economists. So these are forecasts for U.S. GDP growth in 2025. Just to clean up this year, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, J.P. Morgan Chase, all clustered between 1.5 and 2%. The International Monetary Fund predicts that in 2026, the U.S. economy will grow around 2.1%. If you look at these same bank researchers and some others, generally speaking, many economists are converging around expected GDP growth next year at 2%. So, next year should be a year of growth. Now, I will say that's very concentrated. So if you look at just data center construction, if you look at the artificial intelligence infrastructure build, that's probably going to add by itself 1.5% to GDP next year. Beyond that, there's not much else driving the economy, which helps explain why the recession probabilities are so high. So these are recession probabilities over the next 12 months. Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, J.P. Morgan, 30 to 40% recession probability. In a typical year, risk recession is between 10 and 15%. So why is it so elevated now? Let me tell you why. It's because the foundation of economic growth in America has narrowed so dramatically over the course of the year. A year ago, we're adding tons of jobs. And those households securing those jobs were benefiting from the associated income growth. Now, yeah, inflation was still high, don't get me wrong. But at least in nominal terms, non-inflation adjusted terms, they had more income to spend. Now, what do we see in America? Not much job growth. And, many Americans in earlier periods of this economic expansion cycle were switching jobs frantically. And we hated that, right, as employers, right? They were disloyal. But now in hindsight, we might realize why they were switching jobs so frequently is because inflation was so high, they had to chase the highest wage to maintain their standard of living. But now they don't have that higher wage job to go to. There's not much hiring taking place in the economy. And so, given that, and given that only a handful of segments driving the economy forward, the artificial intelligence infrastructure build out, the stock market's performance, the spending by wealthy households, the top 10% of American households are responsible for nearly 50% of retail sales. So to have a recession, you need the wealthy to stop spending, to get nervous. And what would that require? The stock market capitulating to a certain extent. I'm not talking about like April of this year. Stock market fell and rose again. The mantra on Wall Street has been what? Buy on the dips. The mantra is buy on the dips, you never need to sell because if the market falls one day, it's going to come back. But if the market, let's say, didn't come back at some point in the future, it fell and stayed depressed, that would make rich people nervous. That would be enough probably to drive the U.S. economy to recession. And that's the kind of thing that can happen. And that's why the risk of recession is so elevated. By the way, many in construction believe the U.S. economy is already in recession, or at least they're part of the economy's recession. One of the things I do is I serve as the chief economist for Associated Builders and Contractors. We're about 23,000 members around the country, and we serve them each and every month. We just asked a survey question recently, asking the question, do you think that construction is contracting in America? Do you think that the construction industry is in recession? 65% of responding members said, yeah, we're in recession. Many manufacturers will tell you they're in recession. So again, unless you're associated with artificial intelligence, I'll give you another example. One of the things that we survey our contractors on is backlog. For the 1 in 5 contractors that say that they are associated with a data center project, average backlog is 12 months, meaning work to be done under contract yet to be done. So work under contract yet to be completed. 12 months. But for the contractors that are not associated with a data center project, backlog is 8 months. So, we're basically out of time. So let me conclude. Though Out of Time was also a 2003 Denzel Washington film that also starred Eva Mendes, though I've yet to meet her. But I'm scouring airports around the country. Now, could the economy surprise the downside? It already is. It already has. Think about what people were thinking coming into this year. The thinking was, my goodness, if the U.S. economy could expand under President Joe Biden, imagine what it can do under President Donald Trump, a businessman. But things have worked out differently, right? Inflation has been coming back and it's poised to stage an ongoing comeback. And I blame tariffs and to a certain extent shifting immigration policy for that. Again, I understand that tariffs seek to achieve arguably some very laudable goals, right? Reindustrialization of America, defense of the country by making sure we produce enough semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, steel, aluminum, rare earth materials, etc. I understand that. Ships. But it is inflationary. And therefore, interest rates will be higher for longer because, again, interest rates are anchored by expected inflation, especially long-term interest rates at which we actually transact. Many consumers not exhausted financially, we talked about that, and their circumstances could worsen, right, because of inflation, and in part, again, driven by tariffs. Are asset prices overextended? That's a big question. I don't know the answer to that. You may have heard that on the S&P 500 recently, the price-earnings ratio has been between 22 and 23. Many investment managers will remind you that that's at the 90th percentile, meaning 80%, 85 to 90% of the time, the price-earnings ratio is less than it is right now. I mean, prices are high per unit of corporate earnings. And what goes up can come down. So we've got some real risks there. So forecast was for growth in 2025. We grew in 2025. The forecast is for growth in 2026, but now there's some real risks, including rising interest rates. Remember, short-term interest rates can fall, long-term interest rates can still rise over the same period. That's exactly what happened late last year. The Federal Reserve was cutting interest rates, mortgage rates still rose during that period. They don't move hand in hand, short-term rates and long-term rates. And asset prices, of course, could fall. There's been lots of chatter recently, not just about private credit, but about an AI bubble, NVIDIA stock or whatever it happens to be. And so we've got lots of risks, and a lot of that risk comes out of Washington, D.C. And by the way, next year, midterm elections. With that, I'll leave you. I want to point out that we have a newsletter at www.sagecon.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not necessarily for dollars. If you're not interested in the newsletter, please, anytime, feel free to go ahead and pound sand. And for Kahua, thank you again for the opportunity. I hope you have a great New Year's and a great 2026. And I hope to see you in person at some time in the future. Thanks a lot.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much for being part of our day, our Build Forward. Kahua has been so proud to sponsor this event today, the first Build Forward, and we hope that the day has brought you new information and exciting possibilities. Please notice that there'll be 2 different pop-ups on your screen now. One will tell you about our standing demo series that happens live every other Thursday. You can learn a lot more about Kahua if you're interested there. The other is about our solutions showcase, in which we regularly dive deep into our cost management solutions. And as a follow-up to today's Build Forward event, you'll receive an email with all today's sessions available on demand. Please share those with your friends as you see necessary or as you see valuable to them, and you can watch them yourselves anytime. As a courtesy to us, if you would please also fill out the survey that you'll receive in that same email. That survey will help us direct the content for the next Build Forward event and those going forward. Again, we're glad you were part of this today. Thank you so much for your time. From Kahua, I'm Nicholas Johnson. Thank you. Have a good night.